Imagine you're at a party. The room is full of people laughing, hugging, swapping stories. And somewhere in the corner, there's one person, drink in hand, phone out, doing that thing we all recognize as pretending to be busy. Maybe that person is you. Maybe it was you once, or maybe you're thinking of someone you know. Here's the question nobody asks out loud. What if some people genuinely don't have friends? Not because something went wrong socially, but because of something deeply wired into who they are. We live in a world that treats friendship like oxygen. You need it. You must have it. Loneliness is a crisis, a health epidemic, a sign that something has broken down. And yet, there are millions of people walking around with no close friends, not friendless because of some tragic falling out, but just without. And we never really talk about why, because it's easier to assume the answer is simple, awkward, antisocial, broken. But psychology tells a much more interesting story. Let's start with the brain, because that's where everything interesting begins. Your brain has what researchers call a social baseline theory, the idea that the human nervous system evolved to expect other humans nearby. When you're with people you trust, your brain actually offloads some of its threat monitoring to them. You relax, your cognitive load drops. Being with friends, in a very literal neurological sense, is easier than being alone, for most people. But here's where it gets fascinating. Not everyone's nervous system works the same way. For a significant portion of the population, estimated around 30 to 50% who fall on the more introverted end, the presence of other people doesn't reduce the cognitive load, it increases it. Their brains are processing more, not less. Social interaction, even pleasant interaction, is effortful in a way that it simply isn't for others. So the very thing that recharges most people drains them. Now imagine going through childhood and adolescence with a brain like that. You're surrounded by kids who seem to effortlessly form bonds over shared lunches and playground games, and you're there wondering why it all feels like running in sand. You don't hate people, you're not broken, you're just operating on a different energetic frequency, and nobody handed you a manual. This is where attachment theory walks into the story. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who essentially built the field, argued that our earliest relationships, primarily with caregivers, create what he called an internal working model, a kind of emotional blueprint that tells us, are relationships safe? Are people reliable? Will connection ultimately hurt me or help me? If those early experiences were inconsistent, cold, or unpredictable, the brain learns a very efficient lesson. Closeness is risky, and so it protects you the only way it knows how, by quietly discouraging deep connection before it can become a threat. The cruel irony? Most people who carry this pattern, what psychologists call avoidant or fearful avoidant attachment, don't even know it's happening. They just feel vaguely uncomfortable when relationships get too deep. They pull back right when things get meaningful. They tell themselves they prefer their own company, which may even be true, but there's a difference between genuinely thriving in solitude and using solitude as armor. And solitude, when chosen rather than imposed, is actually one of the more misunderstood states in psychology. The research on positive solitude, a term developed by psychologist Esther Buchholz, suggests that time alone isn't just something introverts tolerate, it's something humans need in order to integrate experience, process emotion, and develop a coherent sense of self. The problem is that culture has convinced us that spending time alone is pathological, that the person who spends their Friday night with a book instead of friends is losing some invisible competition. But Buchholz would say that person might be doing some of the most important psychological work of their life. That said, and this is important, there is a real and meaningful difference between solitude and chronic loneliness. Solitude is a choice. Loneliness is the ache that lives in the gap between the connection you have and the connection you want. And here's the uncomfortable truth that research keeps confirming. You can be surrounded by people and feel devastatingly lonely, and you can be largely friendless and feel genuinely content. The external picture tells you almost nothing about what's happening inside.
So why do some people stay in that friendless place even when they don't want to? This is where social anxiety does some of its most invisible, most damaging work. Because social anxiety isn't just shyness, it's a cognitive distortion machine. It takes ordinary social interactions and runs them through a catastrophizing filter. That slightly awkward pause in conversation becomes, "they think I'm boring." A text that went unanswered becomes, "they don't actually like me." An invitation you declined once becomes, "I've probably ruined it now." The emotional cost of this constant second guessing is enormous. And so the brain, trying to protect you from the pain of rejection it's certain is coming, starts to quietly steer you away from the situations where friendship could even form. It's not laziness, it's not apathy. It's the brain doing what brains do best, finding the most efficient path to safety, even when that path leads somewhere lonely.
There's another piece to this that almost nobody talks about, and it has to do with what psychologists call autistic traits. And I want to be careful here because this isn't about diagnosis. It's about the reality that a significant portion of people who struggle with friendship are simply neurologically wired to find the rules of social engagement genuinely confusing. The unspoken codes, when to text, how often, what counts as a real friendship versus a casual acquaintance, how to make the leap from knowing someone to actually being close. These things that seem intuitive to most people are, for others, genuinely opaque. Not because they don't care, often precisely because they care too much, and the fear of getting it wrong keeps them frozen at the edges of connection. And then, stay with me here, there's the simple, practical reality of adult life. Because even psychologically healthy, securely attached, socially confident people often find themselves without close friends at 30, 40, 50. Because friendship requires time and proximity and repetition, the same three ingredients that school and university hand you for free and adult life quietly removes. Sociologist Robin Dunbar, who famously identified that humans can maintain roughly 150 stable social relationships, also found that close friendships require around 200 hours of accumulated time together before they solidify. 200 hours. Think about how many friendships you've almost had. People you liked, people you clicked with, people who simply didn't make it over that time threshold because life got busy and nobody quite put in the sustained effort. So, what do we do with all of this? Here's the reframe I want you to carry out of this video. The person who has no friends is not a cautionary tale. They are not a failure. They are almost always someone whose brain, history, nervous system, or circumstances created a specific kind of distance from connection. And the cruelest part is that nobody ever explains to them why it keeps happening, so they conclude the answer must be that something is simply wrong with them. But understanding is the beginning of change. When you can see the attachment wound, you can work with it. When you recognize the social anxiety for what it is, a misfiring protection system, not a verdict on your worth, you can start to gently challenge it. When you understand that adult friendship requires deliberate, effortful cultivation in a way childhood friendship never did, you stop waiting for it to happen organically and start investing in it the way you invest in anything that matters. And if you're someone who genuinely thrives with minimal social connection, that's not a disorder. It's not something to fix. Your nervous system is valid. Your need for solitude is real. The only question worth asking is whether the life you have matches the life you actually want, not the life the world tells you that you should want. I'd love to know where you land on this. Have you ever found yourself on the outside of connection and wondered why? Drop it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people are reading and nodding. And if this kind of deep, honest psychology content is something you want more of, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.